Good evening, and welcome to the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial Library. I am Linnea Hegarty, the Director of Events, Exhibits, and Development for DC Public Library. We are really pleased to host you here tonight in celebration of the Centennial of the National Capital Planning Commission and the opening of this great new exhibition about NCPC's history in the district. We're excited to be the first host of the exhibition and eager for the Kennedy Center and other libraries to host it as well in the coming months. The history of NCPC is our city's history. We DC longtimers like to say that the national city is not our city, the whole district versus Washington thing. But over its 100 years, NCPC has had an enormous impact on the city that we live and work in. In fact, NCPC's influence can be felt right here in this building. We worked closely with Marcel and his team on the modernization of this building, which we hope you all agree was a very successful collaboration. It's important for us. It's important for us to acknowledge and study the history of NCPC, to appreciate its achievements and learn from its mistakes. We're very proud to have worked with the NCPC on this exhibition, and the team has been so amazing to work with. We're really grateful to have had such great partners. And we hope that visitors will learn important details about how the city they live in was shaped by this institution. We hope you'll also visit our permanent exhibition on the 4th floor, which has a little bit more about this history and other stories about DC. And now I'd like to introduce Terry Goodman, Chair of the National Capital Planning Commission. Terry, thanks again for your partnership. We're thrilled to celebrate this occasion with you.
Thank you so much, Linnea. We really appreciate everything you've done to make this possible. We love the wonderful partnership that we have between National Capital Planning Commission and the terrific team at the District of Columbia Public Library and the DC Public Library Foundation. And together we have worked to develop this exhibit with the help of Julia Koster and other staff at NCPC. Thank you for all the work that you've done. And we're excited that this exhibit is not only going to be here, as Linnea mentioned, it's going to be traveling throughout the coming months, throughout DC, to different venues. And there is a lot to learn, so I hope everyone gets a chance to take a look at it if you haven't already. But again, I'm Terry Goodman. I am the new chair. I've been in this position for about a year and maybe not even a year and a half yet, but I'm learning a lot. I hail from Iowa. So I'm not a DC native. I do work for a city. I work in government relations, though, so I've been traveling to DC over the past almost 30 years. So this is a home away from home, but it's always a place that I come to that inspires me, because for those of us who don't live here, it has a different persona, if you will. But I'm very excited now to be appointed by the President to serve as the chair of the National Capital Planning Commission and to work with this incredible team that we have at the Planning Commission and to learn about all the incredible work that goes into making this city the great community and the great capital that it is, that reflects these aspirations that we all share and the dreams that we hope that we can bring to fruition. And I would like to welcome you here in celebration of the 100th anniversary of the NCPC. This is it today. June 6th is actually our actual centennial. So we're very happy that we're able to celebrate with all of you. And we do see this not only as an opportunity for celebration, but also an opportunity for reflection. We're pleased that President Biden has congratulated NCPC on its centennial, and there is a letter here that he sent us. It's on an easel over by the cupcakes, which we can only have after this panel discussion. And I hope you get a chance to read it. But in the letter, he noted that, I hope you feel great pride in the role that NCPC has played in preserving the legacy of Washington, D.C., while promoting a positive vision for its future. And I think that that is true. I hope that we can see that and see that as the role of the NCPC, celebrating our past and looking at the challenges of the future with more creative and innovative eyes. And that I can assure you is being brought to us by the staff and the partnerships that we have at NCPC. And I want to express specifically my appreciation for the many chairs that have preceded me, as well as commission members past and present. who have served diligently and with great respect for our mission. I want to particularly recognize former Chair Tom Gallus, who is in the audience tonight, right here, he's right in front. Thank you, Tom. And while we've just met, I've heard legions about you, so I'm excited that you're here. And we want to note that former chairs Preston Bryant Jr., Beth White, John Cogbill, and Harvey Gant have sent their best wishes. And I also want to recognize my colleagues, current commissioners, who are serving with me right now. And included here tonight, our Vice Chair, Betty Hewlett, is here this evening. Betty. And I know we have Commissioners Tammy Stidham, Commissioner Christy Dunstall-Williams, and Commissioner Arrington Dixon, who all said they would be here this evening. So if they're here, we want to give you a round of applause as well. And of course, the foundation and background, our Executive Director, Marcella Costa, and the staff from NCPC. Thank you, Marcella. So tonight is the launch of the exhibit Planning Washington, Capital and Community. As a deliberately planned and purpose-built capital, Washington, D.C. is the physical embodiment of its political role as the seat of our federal government. And it is also a community where people live, work, and play. We hope to engage in a conversation about how these interests have and continue to be balanced. NCPC's mission is to plan for the future federal needs by working closely with federal agencies and our local partners in a way that honors our past and our continuing purpose as America's capital. Our NCPC exhibit considers some of the big transformative planning ideas of the mid-20th century, mostly celebrated at their start. As we celebrate the agency's successes, we also acknowledge the mistakes and injustices of our past federal planning practices and learn from our history as we plan for a more equitable and resilient future. Our hope is that this exploration of NCPC's history will encourage a deeper discussion about the work we do today and how we think about addressing opportunities and challenges in the future, from climate resiliency to evolving federal workplaces and urban centers. I hope you're inspired by the imagination, innovation, and impact of the many people who have contributed to shaping Washington, D.C. into a beautiful, admired place that reflects our democratic aspirations. Now, with that, I'd like to turn this over to Julia Koster to start this evening's program. Oh! I'm sorry. Then Ms. Roth, I'd like to introduce you to Ms. Roth, who's going to open tonight's panel discussions. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Chair Goodman. All right, so I am Bisrat Mezgebe. I am with NCPC's Office of Public Engagement. It's a pleasure to be with you all tonight. I am here to provide a run-through of the stories displayed in the Centennial exhibit, which is right behind you. I think most of you all have gotten a chance to spend some time with it this evening, but if you haven't, please make sure that you do before you leave the library tonight. And the history I'll be presenting will also be the starting point for our panel discussion. Like the exhibit, my presentation focuses on NCPC's first 50 years, from 1924 to Home Rule in 1974, a time marked by great change. We wanted to better understand how NCPC's work during this time shaped the city and the region we experience today and how this helps us look to the future. Before beginning, I want to thank our colleagues at Prologue DC who for their great research and technical support. I think they're coming in right now, and also the exhibit production team at Capitol Museum Services for their great work. NCPC is the federal government central planning agency in the National Capital Region, which includes Washington, D.C., and the adjoining counties in Northern Virginia and Maryland. Congress established NCPC in 1924 to provide park planning and acquisition. Its mission was expanded in 1926 to include the fledgling field of planning, and address the needs of a rapidly growing city. In 1952, the National Capital Planning Act gave NCPC planning responsibilities for the federal and local city. For much of the District of Columbia's history, the city was federally controlled, and the relationship between federal and local interest is a really important lens to understand this history. Washington has often been a showcase and even a laboratory, often subject to very hands-on guidance from Congress and the White House. Washington is unique as a capital city and the seat of the federal government. In the mid-19th century, NCPC played a significant role in shaping the region's parks, transportation systems, and development patterns. These were often big, transformative ideas, and some are still appreciated today, like our region's beautiful parks and extensive metro rail system. Yet the planning outcomes from this era were sometimes inequitable and had lasting consequences. So we'll start with some of the history before NCPC was established in 1924. Indigenous people had long inhabited this area located at the confluence of the two rivers that you see here, and we acknowledge that we're on the ancestral lands of the Nacotchtank or Anacostans. As you've already heard and as you'll continue to hear, as a planned and purpose-built capital, Washington is the physical embodiment of its political role as the seat of our federal government. You'll recognize some familiar faces in this painting. Pierre L'Enfant, Benjamin Banneker, and others established the formative master plan for the new federal city on a location selected by President George Washington. The 1791 L'Enfant Plan was formalized by Andrew Ellicott in 1792. And the 1902 McMillan Plan, developed by a Senate-appointed committee, provided the framework for today's National Mall and Monumental Core of federal and civic buildings using City Beautiful principles. It also proposed a citywide system of parks and open spaces. In response to the Cairo building's height, the federal 1910 Height of Building Act established height limits, resulting in the horizontal skyline dominated by civic structures that distinguishes Washington from other cities. These plans and acts, which predate NCPC, continue to shape Washington, D.C. today, and NCPC is an important steward of them. But also, what you see and experience here today has been deeply shaped by planning and development decisions over the last 100 years. So let's talk about the last 100 years quickly. Park acquisition and planning was an important aspect of NCPC's early work. Today, Washington has more green space per capita than any other U.S. city of its size. 80% of Washington's parks and open spaces are federally controlled, and they serve as settings for our most important civic institutions, national events, and local gatherings. At the same time, we recognize that NCPC's land acquisition for parks displaced communities, including at Fort Reno, where a thriving African-American community was displaced to create a whites-only recreation center, park, and reservoir. These images show NCPC's land acquisition maps and the children of the Scott family, who lost 3 properties there. NCPC's planning for parks and recreation facilities reinforced racial segregation by designating whites-only and blacks-only recreation sites, as shown in this 1944 map. Washington is a company town. The federal government has been the city's largest landowner, employer, office space user, and has driven the regional economy. As the federal government's interests have evolved, so has Washington's physical landscape. These images show the diversity of federal facilities, which are a distinctive aspect of the capital region. And decisions about where they are located and how they are operated shaped our city and region, resulting in tremendous economic impact. These decisions brought benefits, but also costs, such as barriers and displacement, particularly to poor communities and communities of color. Through its early comprehensive planning, NCPC helped shape not only federal development, but growth patterns for the entire region, creating outcomes that we must consider today. Here's an example. NCPC's comprehensive plan recommended building highways through and beyond the city with a proposed 3-ring highway system. The plan anticipated the continued movement of residents and federal government offices out of Washington, but did not foresee the larger economic and social impact of white flight. What's also interesting is this map shows dispersed federal facilities. This reflects the transportation and suburban development thinking of the day and was also a direct response to Cold War fears. Then and now, security concerns have had a huge impact on the location and growth of federal campuses and installations. In 1945, Congress directed NCPC to prepare a comprehensive plan to guide efforts in what would become known as urban renewal. Washington's urban renewal activities were a federal laboratory for what would become a national program to address what was deemed slum housing and blight. You might not know that Southwest Washington was one of the nation's first and most complete urban renewal projects. Praised by local business leaders and national professional organizations, urban renewal there resulted in the new Southwest Federal Center and created entirely new neighborhoods, all developed in the mid-century modern architectural style. As one NCPC publication put it, the future comes to life. Yet this model for urban renewal came at a cost. Most of the neighborhood was razed, displacing over 13,000 people and over 1,500 businesses, predominantly African American. Almost none of the people who lost their homes could afford the new housing in their old neighborhood. Today, inequities persist, and planners still grapple with actions to address these impacts. Along with urban renewal, highway development was a powerful idea with strong national support. Spurred by matching federal dollars, major highway projects were proposed in Washington. Here's a map of the inner loop, about a mile around the White House, with connections to a regional system. The solid pink lines show what was built, and the dashed lines show what wasn't. The immediate impacts were divided and displaced neighborhoods. Over time, these highways shaped regional development, offering mobility and sustaining suburban growth, while households and businesses left the city. In disenfranchised Washington, the public reaction to urban renewal, highway development, and loss of historic buildings was strong, with citizen protests slowing, reshaping, and even stopping some projects. However, highways such as the Anacostia Freeway were constructed and disproportionately impacted poor and minority communities. Urban renewal continued across the city, reshaping many neighborhoods as seen in this map. However, the negative reaction to urban renewal in Southwest spurred a change in subsequent projects. Was anyone going to tell me that was happening? Thanks, guys. However, the negative reaction to urban renewal in Southwest spurred a change in subsequent projects. For example, the Shaw community fought for a greater say and more opportunities for residents to return to proposed redevelopment projects. NCPC also paid more attention to community organizing to shape plans that better address the needs of existing residents. The pivot to construction of a metro rail system was a critical response to highway development in the late 1960s. In the 1950s, NCPC recommended only a modest rapid rail system for the Washington area. As public demand grew for using highway funds to finance a subway system instead, NCPC withheld support for the freeway plan throughout the 1960s. The Washington Metropolitan Area Transit Authority was created in 1967. Congress eventually released funding formerly reserved for building freeways. Today, Metro connects communities, spurs sustainable development, and continues to move people. So across these stories of planning and development, people matter, I'd like to quickly highlight two NCPC chairs who show the evolving nature of planning in Washington. The first is Harlan Bartholomew, who chaired the commission in the 1950s, and prior to that was a primary consultant to the commission. Recognized by the American Planning Association as a planning pioneer, he is credited as the first professional planner and created the first professional planning consultancy. He developed zoning codes and comprehensive plans for cities across the United States, including Washington's first zoning code and comprehensive plan. And as an influential and sought-after leader, he helped shape policies on highways, housing, and planning across the country. Yet Bartholomew's legacy praised in his time, is problematic. His work institutionalized regional segregation and resulted in displacement, barriers, and sprawl. Elizabeth Rowe was appointed to NCPC by President Kennedy in 1961 and then became the Commission's first female chair. She was a native Washingtonian and part of the city's political elite who championed different ideas than that of Bartholomew. On a commission often deadlocked over highway development, she fought against further highways and advocated for a regional metro system. And her lasting legacy was in laying the critical foundation for today's historic preservation programs. With these two people, we see very different approaches as planning evolved away from big vision, top-down decision-making, often made by people who are not based in Washington, towards community-based, responsive ideas that sought to protect neighborhoods, resources, and cultural heritage. So pushback to highways and urban renewal were part of the larger civil rights effort towards enfranchisement in the District of Columbia. Home Rule in 1974 had a profound impact on how planning is done here. NCPC kept planning responsibilities for all federally controlled properties in Washington, along with its regional responsibilities, while the newly elected District of Columbia mayor was responsible for planning in the city's non-federal areas. Since Home Rule, shared stewardship has been a critical aspect of planning in Washington. The comprehensive plan for the national capital reflects our unique planning responsibilities, with NCPC preparing the federal elements and the city preparing the district elements. The district also has members on NCPC's commission, while federal representatives are part of the DC Zoning Commission. Partnerships are essential to achieving shared goals. One example is the Anacostia Waterfront Initiative, which has continued to shape the renewal of the river and adjoining communities. Another is the current work to revitalize Pennsylvania Avenue, benefiting federal and district interests alike. So that brings us to the present and the questions that NCPC is considering today. Number one, what stories should be told? Commemoration is how we tell our country's stories. Finding new ways to tell more diverse stories in the context of limited public space is an important challenge. Two, how can we be open and safe? Security concerns and their impact on how people experience public spaces remain a top planning concern. Three, how should we grow? Technology, the impact of the pandemic, climate change, and other issues are changing how and where people live, work, and get around. And lastly, how can communities benefit from federal development? We must consider how large, single-use, and often secure federal facilities do or don't connect with adjoining neighborhoods. By learning from our past practices, NCPC and other federal agencies can be better neighbors. So thank you for letting me take you on this walk through history. We have much to celebrate and much to consider, and as we look to the future, we must balance our aspirations as the nation's capital with those of the communities who call this region home. To discuss this in more detail, I'm going to turn this over to Julia Koster, who will introduce our panelists, but first I'll need to take a few seconds to rearrange the stage. Give us just a minute. Thank you.
Thank you. While we're rearranging the stage, once we get the chairs, I'll ask our panelists to come up. I again want to thank Bisrat for her great opening on this. And I'll also say if you're on the sides and you want to grab a seat in the middle, this is your golden opportunity. So it's just like being at your favorite Taylor Swift concert if you want to get the seats up close. So why don't you go ahead and come on up. And if you don't mind, is my mic on? Testing. Everybody want to test really quick? Try it again.
Testing again. There we go.
Don and Uva, do you want to give it a, it's working? Okay. So now we're on to the next part of our program. Again, thank you so much for being here. My name is Julia Koster. I'm NCPC's Director of the Office of Public Engagement. Better? I'll do it like a rock star here. And I did want to note Denise Leibowitz was going to be the panel moderator. She was exposed to COVID, and so out of an abundance of caution, she's at home, and we wish her the best. As Bisrat noted, we developed the Centennial exhibit to better understand our history as an agency and also how planning has evolved and how it has shaped Washington as we experience it today. We also want to think a little bit and learn from our history to see how we can have lessons that will shape our work in the future. The exhibit considers the challenges of planning in Washington, again, where the needs of a thriving community coexist with the aspirations for a national capital. We think the exhibit provokes a number of questions around the topics of equity, power, and decision-making. So we've invited 3 really exceptional panelists to explore these issues. To start tonight's conversation, what we've asked them to do is each of them will spend about 5 minutes discussing their reaction to the exhibit, share their thoughts on where we are today a little bit, to give us a grounding, and then we'll go into a moderated discussion. So let me introduce each of them. You've also got their bios in your program, but they're just so great that I want to keep talking about them all the time. So we're going to start with Uwe Brandes. He is a professor of practice and the faculty director of Georgetown University's Urban and Regional Planning Program and Georgetown Global Cities Initiative. He also serves as chair of the DC Commission on Climate Change and Resiliency. I think Uwe is a scholar practitioner in urban design and sustainable urban development. He's prepared urban development plans for cities across the U.S. and abroad. And here in Washington, he served as the associate director of the DC Office of Planning, where he managed the award-winning Anacostia Waterfront Initiative. Uwe, can you get us started? Yeah.
Thank you so much, Julia. I do want to start off with just a very, very big thank you. Thanks for everyone coming tonight, but a big thank you to NCPC. This is it's a huge milestone. It's a 100-year birthday, and we're going to have cupcakes after this. This is amazing. So it's really an important milestone, and it's absolutely worthy of great celebration. And I want to kick things off. There's lots of things that we're going to explore here tonight, and I just also want to, right off the bat here, right off the start, congratulate NCPC for already opening the door and inviting all of us into the critical reflection of NCPC's history. I think that's part of this celebration, is that critical reflection. And I'm really struck by the choice of venue. The choice of venue didn't have to be here. It could have been somewhere else. I think it's really electric, actually, to be here in this space at this time. And I just want to commend NCPC for that. I've got just a couple of keywords I just want to hit quickly in order to open up this dialogue. And they are coordination, influence, and impact. So let me just talk about coordination, influence, and impact. So what is NCPC? It's a planning entity. It always has been. In some parts of its history, it's actually been even more than that during the parks days. But it's a planning organization, and the coordination is the core work of the entity. Planning is coordination. It includes the incredibly important decision-making process of understanding and determining who you're going to even talk to, who you're going to recognize as stakeholders, and it is such an important process associated with synthesizing the often very complex issues of cities. NCPC has aspired to be holistic from the very beginning, and that is certainly in alignment with planning practice. And importantly, and I think this is, the subject of great debate on every single individual project that I've ever seen go through the commission, there's this wonderful and very polemic question, which is, what is the federal interest in a given project? And that deliberative process associated with understanding how planning practice works and gets applied to decision-making within Washington, D.C. has been the core work of NCPC. And this work carries extraordinary responsibility. It's advancing the common good, and doing so in a context where you're dealing with local issues and architects and landscape architects and building programs in the context of a mission of building the nation's capital. I just think that this entire process of coordination is something that we should take stock of. Second is influence. The process of planning is about creating and influencing. You're communicating decisions, you're reinforcing norms, you're seeking consensus, and at times you need to govern, you need to guide, correct. This is the influence that NCPC has exerted from the very beginning and continues to today. The manner in which this influence has been exerted has been incredibly impactful, not only in the projects that we see in the exhibit, but it has been incredibly impactful in the definition of professional planning practice in this country. And so I think there's a whole body of knowledge and history associated with how NCPC's practices have spilled over into other practices in other cities. And indeed, these practices are not limited to capital cities and the capitals of states across this country. These practices have spilled over to capitals around the world, and NCPC has set the bar, and we can have a critical conversation about that bar, but NCPC has set the bar on what the planning of a national capital city involves. And then finally, impact. Any given project, any given application that comes through NCPC is all about impact. It's about shaping the city in a material way. And we think of the parks, and we should take such great pride in this. The parks of this city are so distinctive, so impactful. The mall itself, and we love to, as Washingtonians, and there's not a person in this room that does not have a strong opinion on the design and the planning of the National Mall. This is the work of NCPC. And yes, this extends to the legacy of highway planning, the legacy of reimagining and forcibly relocating people who live in neighborhoods in this city. And it extends in a very contemporary way, in a way that we still are debating with great passion, this question of federal security of what makes people safe in this city. And so taken together, this idea of coordination, this idea and practice of influence, and the goals of impact, these are three ways of beginning to shape this conversation. And again, thank you very much for this opportunity and this opportunity to reflect.
Oh, great. Thank you so much, Uva. And it's really exciting for those of us who work at NCPC to have anybody else even bring up the federal interest and explore that. It's actually really cool and great for our conversation today. Next up is Zach Schrag. He is the professor of history at George Mason University, where he works on urban development, public policy, and technology. Among the books he has authored is The Great Society Subway, A History of the Washington Metro, in which he argues that Metro is best understood as the concrete manifestation of great society ideals. Along with his many scholarly publications, he's also served as editor of Washington History. For those transportation, you know who you are, the transportation people in the room, you'll be thrilled to know that he recently received an NEH award for his proposal, Rail Against Sprawl, A History of the Dulles Corridor Metro Rail Project. So we're getting a continuation of the story. And with that, Zach, I'd just love to hear your thoughts.
Thank you so much. So I'm very pleased to be here tonight, and also I was very honored to have participated in a few advisory committee sessions about the exhibit that you can see. There is never any one interpretation of history. History is a conversation, a debate, and we had some very vigorous and I hope productive debates with various scholars of DC that you can see in the exhibit, but also notice there's the panel about what do you think, which is a reminder that history is never ending, but is a continuing process. I'd like to make my 3 points here that I think show up in the exhibit. First is that it would be wonderful if we could draw an easy line between aesthetics and function, or between federal and local. The NCPC, of course, has a sister agency or first cousin or something like that in the Commission of Fine Arts, which also grew out of the Macmillan Plan at the start of the 20th century. And I think their job is a little bit easier, not easy, but easier in that they are thinking more on the aesthetic lines, and the NCPC has to think about the functional lines as well. And this led to some vigorous debates between the two agencies in previous decades, as well as some productive collaborations. So it's very hard to find that balance between something that looks good and something that functions well. And we can all think of our favorite or least favorite examples. I might throw out Federal Triangle as something that is very impressive visually, but that office monoculture has been a problem for many decades, and I think continues to be one. A second major tension is between authority and democracy. We have a lot of stories in the exhibit of too much centralization, not enough listening, and also some heroic tales of people rising up from the grassroots to fight big projects, especially the freeways and urban renewals, but also in the panel on historic preservation, for example, you see people marching and picketing with signs to preserve some of the historic fabric of the city. And for very good reasons, we applaud those protesters, and we think about the wonderful work they did in stopping bad ideas. But there's also too much, there's a possibility of too much protest and too much deliberation and too much consultation, to the point where a very small number of people can block housing programs, can block transportation systems, or other initiatives that would probably be of great benefit to society. I may not be the only one here tonight who is mourning the apparent demise of congestion pricing in New York City. I think that would have been a good thing for transit. I think it would have been a good thing for people who drive. I think that would have been a good thing for a lot of reasons. And enough people made enough squeaky wheel noises that, at least for the time being, that project has been stalled. And so we don't want to go back to the days of Robert Moses, or more locally Harlan Bartholomew, dictating what will be built and what will be demolished, but we also need to find ways to move forward with leadership, as we suggested. And then the final thing I would say is, Uwe mentioned the parks is one thing to celebrate. There's a lot to celebrate in Washington. This is a pretty nice part of the world to live in, a pretty nice city. And, it wasn't until coming here into this room that I realized, wow, look out the windows. This is one of those summer nights where you think, oh, this is what all the architectural and planning, computer software generates with all the people wandering around. I mean, you could do a little scavenger hunt. How many modes of transportation can you see right now? I can't quite see if the bus lanes are jammed over on 7th Street, but, what is this? We've got some, people eating outdoors, people strolling around. You've got the election posters up reminding us of home rule. There goes someone on a scooter, right? You've got historic preservation, of course, in the old patent building. This is not what the NCPC alone created, but something that the NCPC has taken part in. And I think you could find NCPC fingerprints in all manner of some of the wonderful street activity we're seeing outdoors. And I'm just hoping that no car comes speeding down at 7 miles an hour to sort of ruin this moment. But if you look around, I think you can see part of the triumph to which NCPC has contributed.
Wow, thank you, Zach. And I do have to say, this is really, I hadn't thought about how great this space is to give us like the urban planning backdrop that we all aspire to. So thanks for taking a moment so we can look out the windows. Our last panelist, Don Edwards, spends his professional life in the eye of the civic engagement storm, where he is an expert in facilitating difficult conversations and finding common ground among competing interests. Don is the co-founder and chair of the board of Justice and Sustainability Associates, a management consulting firm in Washington. He has worked across the region and around the world with federal and local government agencies, universities, corporations, and the public on a variety of development, planning, and sustainability projects. A longtime DC resident, he has brought his civic engagement skills to very complex development projects, including the Anacostia waterfront, the National Museum of African American History and Culture, master planning of the Nationals baseball park neighborhood, and the 11th Street bridges. Don, you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much, and good evening, everyone. When I learned that I was going to be the last speaker before we move into the next phase, it was kind of daunting because Uwe and Zach bring a lot, and they've already floated many ideas. Because Julia has said that I do a lot of civic engagement, this idea of building an agreement pushes me to say a few things that I hope you will use as a bridge to go into our discussion later on. First of all, I think NCPC deserves a huge applause for, frankly, the courage to surface this history and to organize it and present it in the narrative form that they've done, to make it as accessible as it is, especially using the graphics and the photographs that they put with the interpretive material. I think it's really remarkable, the amount of fealty that NCPC has shown to its mission: advise, adopt, promote planning in the capital region. And I think it's particularly remarkable in the sense that it bears remarking that the language of the exhibit, and I hope you will take up Julia's suggestion, to spend some time reading the exhibit, because behind all the words in the exhibit were, in my mind, a bunch of decisions. There is language there that perhaps in other jurisdictions, certainly some that are not that far away from the District of Columbia, there would be actually difficulty having some of these words, equity and white flight and displacement. These are much more freighted words in different parts of our country. And even in the District of Columbia, there is still a level of freightedness that has to be acknowledged. So I think more than anything, NCPC has done us a great service, one, by by its fealty to the work of planning, which putting things on the table that need to be discussed. Not running from difficult choices and difficult conversations and freighted words, but more importantly, creating a space and a place as using MLK, which is a kind of civic center for the district. Civic in the sense of it is where everyone in the district can be found on any given day. So the issue of accessibility is very profound for me. I want to say a few words about that being, however, if you want to tell a good story, you got to have tension. So here's the tension part. There are now, and I think many of us should be aware of this, very competing visions for the capital region. There have been articulated different kinds of ideas about how this region should develop, who it should serve, who should be the beneficiaries, what should be the benefits. Now, embedded in that is, I think, a recognition that if NCPC is going to have relevance in the next 100 years, there is a challenge that faces it. And I think you use the word, Uwe, consensus building. Well, that's a big word for me. Everybody who knows the work I do is very interested, but consensus building is very hard. When people want 100% of what they want, which doesn't necessarily lead to actionable policies and actionable decisions, but allows people to say, if I don't get this, I'm taking my marbles and going home. I think NCPC is going to find itself having to take on more of the responsibility of having the kind of civic consensus-building conversations that will allow innovation, allow actionable progress to continue to take place in this region and especially in the capital city. I can't imagine that there is a way that you can look at this exhibit and the history, because history, as we know, is prologue. History does not repeat itself, but it prepares us for what we are going to need to face, which leads me to my last comment. I think it's going to be incumbent for a city and a region like the district and the metropolitan Washington region to focus on its civic infrastructure. There is a huge investment already. I think everyone knows that of jurisdictions similar in the rest of the country, the district has invested deeply in making it possible for participation, influence to be practiced and strengthened at many different levels. But there is also the risk of losing that infrastructure. Infrastructure, like all infrastructure, has to be maintained and invested in and grown. And I think we all should be prepared to help NCPC keep the civic infrastructure that it relies upon to be able to implement and develop plans that will be supported in the civic realm. We may be called upon, and we may not have to wait to be called upon. We may need to initiate mechanisms that make sure that the meetings and the planning exercises and the charrettes that keep our planning vibrant and allow us to really continue to see the benefits spread out amongst lots of very different kinds of beneficiaries. I would say that that is one of the things that we should be looking forward in the next 100 years, Julia.
Thank you so much, Don. Wow. So I'm almost overwhelmed by all the different directions the conversation could take right now. I think I'm going to start referring back actually to the exhibit and the phrase capital and community. Uwe, you gave us the federal and local interest. It's how do we balance these two goals for our capital region here? And I also, so this is what I'm going to kind of throw out and see who's going to bite. But Zach, I would really love to have you reflect a little bit on the federal-local balance over time and how we can think about that a little bit. And maybe, Uwe, if you could talk a little bit to some of the examples of where we've been effective in finding that balance. And then, Dawn, I think you actually started tackling the question of whose city is it and how that goes. So I don't know. I've hopefully laid out some other things for the three of you to talk about. And maybe, Uwe, you look like you're ready to talk. You are ready to go. So let's have you go.
I'm really excited because there's one thing I promised myself I would do tonight, and that is to tell a little story. And some of you I know in this room are quite familiar with John Parsons, who represented the National Park Service on the commission for many, many years. I don't know how many years it was. I believe it was in excess of 30 years. And this gives me an opportunity to, I think, respond to your question, Julia, but definitely respond to Zach's comment about aesthetics and projects and jurisdiction of NCPC and this kind of invitation to reflect a little bit on capital community is kind of like the perfect moment. So I came to Washington in 2000, and it was right during this period of time when this new tool was being used by planners called PowerPoint presentations. And as I was, a young, energetic, curious young planner, I tried to spend as much time with knowledgeable people as possible, and had the great pleasure of attending many, many meetings with John Parsons. And John Parsons had a slide carousel with slides in it, and he had several of these, of course. Many of them were focused on specific projects that he was working on. But John had a dedicated slide carousel on his kind of like theory of public space in Washington. And some of you, I'm sure, saw this. And one of the kind of like key points that he made, and one of the like most beautiful photographs of the National Mall that he loved to celebrate, was a picture of the Lincoln Memorial in the background, with the foreground being a game of ultimate Frisbee. And I think this is really important because I want to kind of introduce this kind of idea that I know has been part of the thinking at NCPC, certainly at the National Park Service, in just embracing this idea that as a city, as a national capital of this country, as a demonstration of democracy, we cannot build a national capital without community. It's impossible. You cannot do it. And I reference John right now because even when beginning to think about the aesthetics and the jurisdictions and responsibilities and the breakdown of NCPC and CFA, we have to continue to come back, and I believe we, in this moment, especially need to come back to this idea that as we go about our work building this city, as we go about this work of building this democracy, places and people are not two different things. They have to come together in order for us to do this work. And I believe that's incredibly important for NCPC as it goes about its work today and tomorrow.
Great.
So if I could follow up on that, first of all, I love the fact that Parsons brought up that image. I remember having a conversation with the late Charles Atherton, the Secretary of the Commission of Fine Arts, who was also really a big fan. I think he liked the volleyball on the mall rather than the Frisbee. But again, that idea that the nation's capital, this great imperial structure of the mall and the white columns, would still be open to people in shorts, running around. And that was good for America and good for other countries to see. In terms of this boundary between the federal and the local, this has definitely been a recurrent theme in NCPC's history. I have in my notes here 3 documents written 70 years more or less apart. The first one was quoted by Frederick Guttheim in the first edition of Worthy of the Nation, the not quite official history of the commission published in the 1970s, where he quotes the letter from Frederick Delano to his nephew, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, on leaving the commission. And Frederick Delano says, this commission doesn't really have any power. We can buy some land for parks and playgrounds, but beyond that, we're all kind of winging it here, and a lot of people don't show up for the meetings. I think you might want to rethink the whole commission. He didn't really know what the job of the commission was. Then in the second edition of Worthy of the Nation, Tony Lee fast forwards to the 1980s, and she quotes a GAO report. It was then the General Accounting Office. And I think it comes as close as a GAO report can come to humor, where they've been tasked with explaining how well the NCPC realizes its mission of representing the federal interest. And the GAO investigators went around to the commission, and they basically found out that no one could agree on what that even meant. And they said, we could not respond to questions about NCPC's roles, function, and mission because there is no agreed-on definition of the federal interest. And then the report goes on saying, well, despite this, they seem to be doing some good work. So we don't know what the federal interest is, but somehow we're managing to support it. And then fast forward another 30 years, and Greater Washington's founder, David Alpert, does a blog post on the same theme, where he poses the question of why is the Department of Defense opining on how wide the sidewalks in Georgetown should be? And, it is a kind of absurd overreach at some level, but then he, also brings up some more medium cases. Well, what about the view from the mall? Should the NCPC care about how tall the buildings in Roslyn are? Should they care about how tall the buildings on Florida Avenue are? And his point, I think, was that this is a pretty nebulous concept, the federal interest, because you don't really know where it begins or ends. I'm sure that you can find examples of where the NCPC has been overreaching. I'm sure you can find examples of where it's been underreaching. It is a continuous debate and conversation. And the last thing I want to make on this, point I want to make on this subject is this notion of company town, which can mean a few different things. The original company towns, of course, were wholly owned tracts of lands by coal companies or, Lowell, Massachusetts, where the corporations, for-profit corporations, had a lot more power than even pre-home rule federal government did, because they owned all the property and can boot people out of their homes on a whim. Fortunately, the federal government, for the most part, has not been that. On the other end, you might think of a company town as a place where the employer doesn't necessarily own the property, but because it employs so many people, has a lot of influence. And you can think of Amazon now in Arlington, or not in Arlington, where the ripple effects of Amazon's decision to plan, if not build, HQ2 has really affected all kinds of things, including my university and Virginia Tech and other public investments. And NCPC, again, or the federal government in DC, is somewhere in between the two, because it owns a lot more land than a major employer, and also has, I think, tried to be a little bit more responsive than a major employer sometimes is, but has been trying to be a good neighbor. So maybe one of the things that NCPC could do going forward is think about that metaphor more directly and think about, which have been the good company towns and how have they managed to be a good neighbor without imposing their will on everyone around them.
Can I just have a quick follow-up to that? And that is, you remind me also that, that extends to this whole practice of planning. And the exhibit refers to Berman versus Parker. And it's very interesting to reread that case because, the Supreme Court doesn't really define what planning is. It just observes that there seems to be a group of people that are behaving in a very professional manner and structured manner in these activities. And so I think this is where the kind of like the modeling of behavior and the modeling of practices at NCPC has an absolutely outsized impact.
So, Julia, you want me to talk about whose city? Yeah, that's a great question. It's the folks who are here's city. And I have to say, it is not Harlan Bartholomew's city. And I hope you'll, to have Harlan Bartholomew's picture and to reference him and give him a frame is one of the things that, for me, makes this a very powerful exhibit, because he's like a presence that our country is living with his legacy, and will be living with his legacy for a long time. And so just knowing his name, Harlan Bartholomew, I hope will encourage you to investigate and find out why is he important. Part of the reason why he's important is because then Libby Rowe takes on a greater status. And as I look out in this audience, and I can tell you that even though I see a lot of folks who I've known throughout this career, I see a lot of young people, I see students, and I have to tell you that it is the planning function that gives me a reason to believe that the future has some integrity and some viability. Because there are a lot of people here today that didn't used to have a chance, an opportunity to be here. It was not a given. When I talk about beneficiaries, you all are the beneficiaries, and the work of making it possible for NCPC to continue to deliver benefits to you should not be seen as a given. You should make sure that the tax dollars you paid this federal agency continue to serve you, and be prepared for resistance. Because the idea of actionable planning that actually improves lives, requires people to agree on what those lives should, what the improvement should be, how those lives should benefit. And I don't think we have the kind of civic agreement about that used to be more present. I also think this question of who does the city belong to requires us to look forward and not backwards. Now that we've reached the 100th, the Centennial, we should be thinking about the metrics of success for the second Centennial. Because a lot of work, this exhibit details how attention was created and addressed that got us from Harlan Bartholomew to Libby Rowe, and it got us from urban renewal to model cities, and it got us from the Southwest Freeway and what it did in Southwest to where we have a totally different approach when we talk about the word equity. I just want to say that these are issues, and they require our energy and investment to make sure that they do not get taken for granted, and worse, ignored.
Thanks for diving in on all those questions. And Don, you've brought up the topic of equity. Certainly, part of what moved us as we were developing the exhibit was to look at the issue of how we can look at the decisions of the past and learn from that and think about it in terms of how we want to move into the future. So you've raised the issue of metrics. In fact, all three of you have talked about issues of equity and certainly how the public is engaged and involved and is a beneficiary. Zach, you brought up that tension between how much democracy versus authority we have. Uwe, you've also talked about public participation. So this is a broader question than we discussed, but however you want to talk about this idea of thinking about how to infuse our current work with the lessons we've learned about both the inequitable and unsustainable decisions we've made in the past.
So let me start with a very simple idea, and it's an idea that NCPC has already in the recent past been a leader in, but certainly there's a lot more opportunity and more work that needs to be done, and that is bringing transparency to the planning conversation. NCPC's really been a national leader in digitizing the planning discourse, making its meetings accessible to people long before the pandemic. And I think this issue that Don's starting to talk about, which is really a very complex interdisciplinary understanding of how equity is defined and protected and created, requires really radical transparency. And I think the show suggests, and of course we know, reflecting on the history of planning, that who's in the room matters a lot to what the outcome is going to be. And so I think, as we continue to struggle, some of us, with the plethora of different modes of communication, we really need to kind of be mindful in how we manage information, how we make that information itself accessible in order to create the accessible city, the equitable city that we're trying to achieve.
And I just want to, think about how hard that is. I was just thinking, I was looking at the 1997 Extending the Legacy Plan from NCPC and Commission of Fine Arts, and one of the big ideas there was, well, we've got this big tangle of highways east of the Kennedy Center. If we could only do something about that, we could reconnect the Kennedy Center. And, here we are 27 years later, and I don't know what the status of that. I know there was a report in the fall, but that is a quarter century where someone would have to be sitting in the room and attending the meetings to know what was going on. And I just had this idea. There's some Star Trek episode where there are people who live sped up and they buzz by like mosquitoes or something. I'm getting this right? Like you'd have to live life in a different time scale in order to have meaningful civic participation on a project that could take 25, or in the case of Dulles Rail, 50 years to be debated and achieved. So it is very hard to know how you can have that meaningful participation without just completely exhausting your community and being left with the few stragglers who managed to pay attention for the full 40 years it took.
Yeah, so that's a great, Zach, thank you for that opening, because, yeah, that's right. It may take 50 years because we are going to have more complexity, not less. We have more points of view than we used to. We've got folks who have very clear ideas about what their interests are, and they aren't afraid to articulate them. And so I think there's a conversation that can be had about the time scale of the project. I think there's also a conversation, quite frankly, that needs to be renewed and reinvested in, which is what are the principles that guide our decision making? Let's recognize that underneath, this is where the radical transparency comes in. Underneath the decisions are values and principles. And if we spend as much time recognizing that if we can get some agreement or operational principles that guide us, the project will unfold within the parameters of those principles. And what we have tended to do, which concerns me, and I'm sure it concerns folks in this room and NCPC, is forget about what are we trading off if we don't make it possible to affirm certain civic principles. What we end up with is polarization and the inability to do anything. I like to talk about when people operate in win-lose paradigms, the losers are just looking to win against the previous winners. That to me is just not going to get us anywhere very far. We have to figure out how to do win-win paradigms.
I'm going to bring us towards we're moving towards the wrap-up part of the discussion, but if the past is prologue, I want you to think a little bit about what's before us right now. What choices and decisions are we facing right now that may have the same long-term impact as the decisions that were being made 50 years ago, 100 years ago, whether it was to acquire that parkland, to build that highway system, to proceed with urban renewal. What are those things? And if you were giving advice to NCPC right now, what would be the things that you would say, focus on this, look at this as you move into the future? It could be projects, it could be ways of thinking, as Don has just been articulating. Uva, radical transparency is what this conversation is going to be all about. So whoever wants to start with that, please do.
Funny you should ask, Julia. I've got a list right here. I've been waiting for this moment in the program. Listen, I think I'm humbled as we have this conversation because, with all due respect, I think NCPC has a lot of work to do to undo the harm that has been done in the past. That's a project. It should be framed as a project. It should be framed as an initiative, and whether it's the highways or really the kind of deep, long-term, intergenerational impact that urban renewal still has on this city, we need to frame that as a planning initiative. And so that would be my number one. And it is a little perverse because, NCP, it's a lot of work to fix all of those things from the past. So, but we should embrace it. Thank you. The second is, the talk of the town right now, right? Which is where we are. It's our downtown. And we are, a number of us that have been involved in revitalization planning in the District of Columbia could not have ever imagined that we would be in the position that we are in right now. And so NCPC absolutely, and has already started, but absolutely needs to continue to think about the future of work in the federal government. This is not an esoteric conversation. It's not just about efficiency of the bureaucracy. This is about the lifeblood of our downtown and our city. It's about the future finances of our city. And we're surrounded here by so many federal buildings that are empty. They're empty, and they're not small. They're really big, right in the heart of our downtown. FBI is just one of them. There's several more, and so this is a major, major undertaking. We didn't ask for this, but we have it. And so here we are, 30 years later, after thinking about, what a revitalized city might be, we really have to start again. And then the last is what, I'll just call the new localism, which is really thinking very critically on a place-based manner, thinking about climate change, thinking about community integrity, thinking about equity. How do these things actually manifest themselves in a place-based way? I think there is greater complexity that we can bring to each of the both big and small projects that come through the NCPC pipeline, because we're not going to fix this with any big single actions. This is going to be many small actions, and NCPC has already demonstrated incredible innovation around climate change and flooding, the eco district. It's just a start. We've got to do a lot more of this in order to understand how we are going to truly make a sustainable and equitable national capital.
As the Virginian up here, I'll bring in the suburbs because I think this is an interesting tension you'll see in the exhibit that really from the Macmillan Commission perhaps onward, it's never been quite clear where the capital of the United States begins and ends. Is it just the L'Enfant City? Is it the District of Columbia? You have, of course, the Pentagon being moved over the river, I believe over the NCPC's objections. And then decades later, the 2005 base realignment process that moved a lot of federal jobs further out, as far as Quantico or Fort Meade. And that really messes with a lot of plans. I've been reading some of the coverage from that era, and people are saying, we did all this work to get people on top of metro stations, to coordinate different federal agencies, and the Defense Department snaps its fingers, and suddenly 50,000 jobs are now in auto-dependent, exurbs. And so that has been a challenge in the past. I think it will continue to be a challenge, but maybe opportunities as well. I do think the Wedges and Corridors plan of 1961 is still having an impact. You can, fly out of National Airport and kind of squint your eyes a bit, and you see something vaguely resembling that diagram, at least, especially on the Maryland side, but even to some extent on the Virginia side. So I do think that that region is going to be a continuing part of the story, but I don't know how that story ends.
Okay, so I have 3 things I'll throw out. I would love for the District of Columbia, the capital city, to provide a model for undoing residential segregation. And if we can do that as the capital city, that would be a benefit to the entire country and lots of cities in the world. I think it's very important that we recognize that when we talk about the downtown UVA, it's not only what's the purpose of the downtowns, but the framing of downtown as a place where things are produced versus where people come together to affirm their communities. I think there's a huge conversation. It's going to take a lot of, because quite frankly, we're still dealing with people who don't want to be living next to people who aren't like them. And then I guess the last thing I would say is generationally, and I'm looking at some of the young people in the room, the climate justice piece is enormous. Can't overstate it. We have got to change direction in such a fundamental way, and we've got to do it with such a heavy investment. And the leadership for that has got to come from so many different places, but who's setting the table? I think NCPC has to be one of the actors who's setting that civic table.
Well, I want to thank all 3 of you for providing these incredibly provocative and thoughtful remarks that I think will inform not only how we are looking at the work that we do now and into the future, but hopefully will also spark a conversation that we can continue to have here in the district, across the region, as we celebrate our centennial and we look at both the great things, the good things that we have done, and the things that we have to perhaps undo, and the things that we'll need to address in the future. I'm looking at the time. I got somebody back there saying, wow, you guys talked for a long time. And what I'd like to do is maybe forego the public Q&A, but we'll all be here afterwards. You're all invited to stay, look at the exhibit, leave your thoughts. There's actually a companion digital exhibit if you want to share this with your friends. And there's a place to leave your comments through a QR code. But the last thing I want to do is invite up our NCPC Executive Director, Marcela Costa, to bring it on home.
Well, I'll just do from here. First of all, thank you so much for your time and for coming out. And I would love to just thank our panelists, Uva, Don, Zach, Julie, and Ms. Rott, for your wonderful presentations tonight. Job well done. And thank you for setting the table for our work program for the next century. But we have a big all ahead of us, but it's really important things that you brought up, and I think we're going to be up for the challenge over the next 100 years as an agency and into the future as we do this work. I'm going to ask you to do two things. So first of all, anybody who served with the commission or the staff, either present or past, please stand. I'd like to thank you for your service to NCPC, to our community, and to our nation for your great work. So thank you so much. And also I'd like to thank the staff who've been involved in the production of this exhibit and this event tonight. Julia Koster, Ms. Rott, Ms. Gebbe, Stephen Stodigal, Steve Morgan, Cale Anderson, Joanna McCrayan, Paul Jutton, who's here tonight. Thank you so much for this great work doing the research. Working with the DC Library, thank you to Linnea, and also Prologue DC, the folks that who helped us with the public history portions of it, and really helped us think through kind of how to tell this story in a very even-handed way, to be honest about our past, but actually think about how that might affect our future, and how we might think about planning as a tool for positive change. And you only can do that by really understanding our history. So I really thank them for making this great presentation and pulling together this exhibit that would really do that. So I am the one person between you and the cupcakes, so I will end it right now. But thank you so much for coming out. Enjoy the exhibit, and let us know what you think about what you've seen and heard tonight. Have a great day.